let me ask you a question. Would you like to know how Magnus Carlsen became the World Chess Champion? And even better, would you like to discover the tricks that Magnus Carlsen used in the just finished 2021 World Chess Championship match to defeat his challenger Ian Nepomniachtchi with the 4th largest percentage score in World Chess Championship history? I'm Grandmaster Max Illingworth, and I just chugged a whole coffee like it was a beer, so I'm really amped up to share with you Carlsen's journey. And if you're amped up as well, make sure to smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm and subscribe to the channel by clicking that red subscribe button. So I'm going to share with you now Magnus Carlsen's journey to the top, how he became the World Chess Champion in 2013 in a Cliff Notes version. If you already know the story, you can always click that timestamp and skip ahead. For those who want to know a few of the juicy details, well, Carlsen started playing chess at 5 years of age, in Norway, when he was taught by his father Henrik. And what his father would do is he would play just with the king, and Carlsen had all the pieces. But Carlsen was so talented at chess that he found this rather boring and didn't really want to play because it's too easy just to beat up a lone king, yes or yes. And Henrik said, okay, I'm not going to push it. We're not going to have a world champion in the household, and that's fine. But then what happened later is, at 8 to 9 years of age, Carlsen saw his older sister playing chess, and being so competitive, he really wanted to beat her. And then it just took off from there. He started becoming the top Scandinavian junior player, winning all the Nordic youth events. So he branched out. And actually, it was in 2002 that he first encountered his 2021 challenger for the World Championship match, Ian Nepomniachtchi. Ian Nepomniachtchi was also this rising junior from Russia, very, very talented. And Nepo was actually getting the better of Carlsen in the earlier games, where he beat him a couple of times. He also pipped him at the post in a few of the European Youth and the World Youth Championships. So Carlsen said, much like I did when I was a junior, you know what? I'm too good for youth competitions. I'm going to go around Europe for 1 hour in the family camper van, because who needs school in any case? And what he did was he had his breakthrough year in 2004. He won the Tata Steel C tournament with an insanely high score. I believe it was 10.5 out of 13, if I remember correctly. If any of these historical details are wrong, just correct me in the comments and I'll give you a heart. And also, after winning this tournament, which gave him his first Grandmaster result, you need 3 Grandmaster results for the title, right? We got his second one then very soon after in the Aeroflot Open in Russia. And then after drawing with Garry Kasparov and beating Anatoly Karpov, two of the greatest world chess champions of all time, in Reykjavik 2004, in Rapid and Blitz. Well, then after this, Carlsen secured his third and final Grandmaster results, technically known as a Grandmaster norm, in the Dubai tournament. And remember this, because Dubai, as we're going to see, is one of the best hunting grounds for Magnus Carlsen, and this is where it all started, when he got his final Grandmaster norm at Dubai, in the Dubai Open, and that made him the second youngest Grandmaster of all time at the time, at the age of 13 years. I forget the exact number of months and days, but it's all on Wikipedia. I mean, what's not on Wikipedia, right? And, I mean, the only one that was younger at the time was Sergei Karyakin, at 12 years, and of course, since then, many other juniors have got the title younger than Carlsen, but he's still in, let's say, the top 10 youngest GMs of all time as such, at the time he got the title, yeah? So then Carlsen was just continuing to plod along, just keep improving, and then he ended up actually getting to a rating of 2,700, younger than anybody else at the time. So 2,700 is kind of rarefied air. It's like, your head is up in the clouds, just near all of the other chess gods as such. And so he got it at that time younger than anybody else. Later on, his record was beaten by Wei Yi, who got it a little bit younger. I think Carlsen got it at the age of 16 or 17. I don't recall exactly, but it was around this ballpark. So he's already a top player at that very young age, even before technically becoming an adult, yeah? And then he had another big breakthrough year in 2009. Before this, he had been steadily improving and got up to, top few players in the world. But then 2009, 2010 was where he started to really distance himself from the rest of the pack, yeah? You had these great players like Anand, the reigning world champion at the time. You had Vasilij Topalov, past FIDE world champion, and players like Kramnik were right up there, Aronian as well. And also some other guys like, I remember, there are a lot of different players. Some of the ones from the top that you see now are still up the top then as well, yeah. But obviously a lot younger. So Carlsen in 2009, he had this breakthrough tournament in Nanjing, the Pearl Spring Tournament, had this performance rank of over 3,000. He was just beating up these Grandmasters 2,700 rated like it was nothing, just complete domination. And then with this, along with a very strong performance in a 2009 London Chess Classic, he reached the *1 rating on the world rankings. And actually, I remember that he also became, at that time, the youngest ever player to break the 2,800 ELO at an age of 18 years, and I forget how many months, but he was close to 19 at the time, yeah? That record actually was very recently broken by Alireza Firouzja, who achieved it 6 months younger, but right now we have this new battle, where it's a question of, well, can Firouzja suddenly gain 65 or more rating points and break Magnus Carlsen's other big record? And that record is that at 19 years and X months, I don't recall exactly, historians, you can put it in the comments, exactly how old Carlsen was when he became the #1 on the FIDE rating list, but at 9 years of age, he did get that #1 position. And briefly, Anand, the reigning world champion at the time, did overtake Carlsen, but then Carlsen got it back. And since then, he's been a #1 player for basically a decade, as such, without anyone ever overtaking him. Actually, his 2018 challenger, Fabiano Caruana, came quite close, where Caruana was 1 win against Carlsen off, reclaiming the #1 spot, but Carlsen kept him at bay, like Muhammad Ali, the shadow boxing and, rope-a-dope style, make sure Caruana would never get a hit in to take his spot. But Carlsen, has shown his dominance, and interestingly enough, in 2011, he actually decided not to play the candidates cycle. For those who are wondering what is the candidates, well, the candidates tournament, or in that case, it was a set of candidates matches, was used to determine who would be the challenger for the World Championship match. But Carlsen felt that this system would not be very fair or be very reliable in determining who the best player was, to play the match. So Carlsen decided not to play, and instead Boris Gelfand won that and played against Anand. And, well, Gelfand came very close, but Anand did retain his title, which sets up for the big showdown. This is the final answer of how Carlsen became the world champion. It all happened in 2013. So admittedly, Carlsen didn't break Kasparov's record of being the youngest ever world champion. Kasparov and Carlsen both became world champion for the first time at age 23, but Carlsen was a little bit older within that year, as it were. So in 2013, Carlsen is playing the candidates tournament, the FIDE candidates tournament, and, well, nearly all of the world's top players were playing it, as you can imagine. Guys like Kramnik, Aronian, Ivanchuk, Rajabov, all the guys are who's who at the time in 8-player double round robin. And Carlsen was clearly doing the best there, especially in the, let's say, early to later part of the tournament, where going into the final 2 rounds, if I remember correctly, I think it was in round 12, that he had this loss with the white piece to Vasily Ivanchuk, who was like having a very up and down tournament. One game he would lose games on time, the next he would just beat the the best playing player in a tournament like it was nothing. So after that, well, suddenly Carlsen, round 14, is tied for the lead with Vladimir Kramnik. And of course, there's only one spot for the World Chess Championship match, right? Because one's already taken by a world champion, and there can only be one challenger to rule them all. So last round, Carlsen is playing white against Peter Svidler, another one of the players in the tournament from Russia. And Carlsen, unfortunately, lost this game with white. But here's the part that was really crazy. On the next board, Kramnik was playing black against Ivanchuk. And going into game, Kramnik assumed, well, Carlsen is such a strong player, #1 on the world ratings, that there's no way he's going to lose with white to Svidler, yeah? So I have to go berserk and win at any cost against Ivanchuk. But winning with black against the top player, as you can imagine, is not so easy, yeah? And so Ivanchuk just completely outplays Kramnik. Ivanchuk wins. And now I can tell you the reason why Kramnik said I had to play for a win and I couldn't just go for a draw. Even though in hindsight is 2020, he could have got that match against Anand in a World Championship match again if he had just drawn with Ivanchuk with black. But the reason he did that is because if Carlsen and Kramnik finished on the same score in that tournament, Carlsen had the better tiebreak and would go on to the match against Anand. And since Carlsen and Kramnik both lost in the last round, they were tied for first place. Carlsen had the better tiebreak, and so Carlsen played the World Championship match against Anand, which I think you probably noticed already. Carlsen ended up winning that match against Anand quite convincingly in 2013. In fact, the match brought some parallels with the 2021 match in terms of how Anand was able to hold Carlsen off for the first 4 games, even get some small chances, but then Carlsen won games 5 and 6 in his trademark style of squeezing the blood out of the stone, taking that slightly better rook end game and converting it into a win with very, very precise technique. It would make a good subject for a video in itself, but let's now get into the current situation, the match that was played just very, very recently in 2021 between Magnus Carlsen and his Russian challenger, Ian Nepomniachtchi. So I have my board here so that you can see it. And if you have been busy doing homework while watching this video, you might say, who's Carlsen? But, you know, Magnus Carlsen, you make the connection against the Russian challenger, Ian Nepomniachtchi. And, well, Nepomniachtchi got there by qualifying for the candidates tournament in 2020 to 2021. That in itself was a special situation, actually, because in the that tournament, it was divided into 2 halves because of COVID, yeah? And Nepo ended up just winning that tournament, being quite dominant. He could actually lose the last round game against Ding Liren and still get clear first place in the tournament, to give you an idea. And so they played their match. Obviously, they've been preparing intensively for 6 or more months with their team, where Carlsen's team consisted of, you know, the usual set of people. His team, you know, his leader, Peter Heine Nielsen, also Laurent Fressinet, another long-time second, Jan Gustafsson, another long-time second at Carlsen, and then some fresh blood as well, with Jordan Van Forest and Daniel Dubov also being the main part of his team. So you can see quite a few creative players in this lineup, and people who get along very well, which is an important part of the chemistry of building your winning team to support you. Because this is the way the World Championship matches work, yeah, to have people giving you the ideas, so you're not having to do all the work yourself, and you can conserve the energy for the actual games in the match, which, as you can imagine, will be quite grueling when you're playing for the world title, yes or yes. Whereas Nepo's team, by contrast, I say Nepo is short for Ian Nepomniachtchi, because, well, Nepo, it just sounds easier to say, rolls off the tongue, yeah? Well, Nepo had the team of a lot of his usual seconds as well, people like Vladimir Potkin. He also had people like Peter Leko and Nikita Vichigov on the team, and Ildar Krulin was another one. And there was one other whose name escapes me at the moment. Maybe you could put in the comments if you have been following the match, but this was the main bulk of his team, as it were. And also even Karyakin actually ended up flying to Dubai actually to help support Nepo when Nepo was starting to unravel a little bit in this match. But we will get to that. And after all, this video is how Carlsen won the World Championship match, more so than how Nepo lost it, but obviously 2 sides of the same coin, yes or yes. So let's get into some of the games. The first part of how Carlsen won the match is based on a quote that was said by Peter Heine Nielsen, which maybe I can share as I play out some of the moves on the board of the first game of the match. What Peter Heine Nielsen said is that, well, in the openings, we don't have to try to kill Nepo out of the opening. What we can do is we can just get Magnus a position that he can sort of play and that he sort of likes to give him the most potential to outplay Nepo later on in the game. And so, by contrast, what Nepo did was he said, oh, I have the most powerful Russian cloud supercomputer helping me, so my analysis is going to be deeper than Magnus's. But Magnus kept finding these little ways to surprise the opponent and take him into territory he's not so familiar. So, for example, against Nepo's attempt to avoid the Marshall Gambit, for those who are wondering what is the Marshall Gambit, it's c3 and d5, and if you look at your database, this is the most common continuation historically to, you know, take the pawn. But it's not something you see all that often at a high level, yeah? Because black gets this very active piece play, and at a high level it's sort of shown that white doesn't really have a way to turn its extra pawn into a kind of serious advantage because black just has too much activity to fully neutralize, as it were. So h3 is sort of an attempt to make d5 less effective by saying, well, I haven't weakened the d file with c3, yep. But Carlsen says, well, I'm going to sack the pawn anyway with knight a5, and this kind of idea definitely has that feel of Daniil Dubov, one of Carlsen's seconds. For those who may not know, Daniil Dubov is a super creative Russian grandmaster, comes up with a lot of very interesting ideas. He's actually even beaten Magnus Carlsen in a match before, in fact, in one of, I think, the Airthings Masters 2020 or 2021, if I recall correctly. But anyway, so this was kind of Dubov's idea to play knight a5 and say, well, if you're not going to let me play d5 in one version, I'm just going to get in another version and play bishop b7 and, get the, the typical Marshall play you might notice at this structure here. Well, it's kind of similar in some ways to the one we saw where white was playing c3. Obviously with some differences, but even so, after a few more moves, which I am not going to really explain here because I already covered it in a video for my Inner Circle members. I can put a link in the description if you want to join my Inner Circle and get more of my Grandmaster secrets. But for now, basically, this is the kind of position that Carlsen aimed for, where, okay, I'm a pawn down, but I've got the bishop pair. I've got some active piece play, and it's not that easy for white to actually consolidate and turn that extra pawn into a more tangible advantage, because, the white queenside pawns are doubled, and therefore it's a bit less flexible than usual. Yes or yes? So Carlsen ended up drawing this first game without any real problems, and that's something that if you're just watching this at home as a kind of casual fan, and maybe you're sort of looking, okay, this is what the engine was saying in certain positions, or you're following news reports, but maybe not analysing a game so deeply yourself, well, you might get this impression of, okay, these were just a bunch of boring draws with black and not much was happening, I want to watch some WWE or MMA or something like this instead for a bit more blood on the board. But actually, being able to neutralise the opponent's white pieces is actually a very important part of winning the match, but obviously when you're just playing against the one other opponent, if you're able to get that first win in the match, it gives you a massive advantage because it forces the opponent to take a lot more risks to try to equalise the score and allows you to kind of play a lot more solidly and say, well, okay, I'm just going to make it very, very hard for you to ever beat me because if I draw the remaining games, I win the match if I already won one before, yeah? So you could say another way of looking at it is that in these sort of matches, it's almost more important not to lose than it is to necessarily try to win at any price. And so I'm going to key to that kind of distinction actually in the through this match. Because what Carlsen did was he played very solidly with black, and then with the white pieces, as I just flipped the board to game 2, he tried to play much more enterprisingly in comparison, trying to find approaches that maybe Nepo's team had not explored so well, but where Carlsen could feel more comfortable in the positions and set a few landmines that maybe Nepo would potentially step on in the heat of battle, as it were. So now we're enjoying some of these military metaphors. Let's see an example from the match where Carlsen... Because there's also another interesting point that Nepo was basically playing pretty much the same repertoire. For example, with black, he was always going for this, knight f6, e6, d5, very solid Queen's Gambit declined. Going for a very solid Petrov against e4, as we'll see later in the match. Whereas Carlsen was sort of saying, well, I'm going to try to find a weakness here, figure out where you're weaker in your preparation, and then when I find that weakness, I'm just going to pound on it over and over again, like Thor's hammer, to throw in a Norwegian reference for Norse mythology. So d5, Carlsen doesn't play the main move of knight c3 and says, okay, you have 10 systems you can play, and you've obviously prepared it very deeply. Carlsen says, oh, no, Nepo. I choose the system, and he played the Catalan, getting this on the board. And it's a very good choice, I think, against Nepo, by the way, in principle, because Nepo is a very aggressive player, really creative, likes to attack, and really sort of set practical problems to the opponent. Because one thing that Nepo was doing in previous times, he was playing quite quickly and quite confidently. So not just putting the pressure on the board, but also putting pressure on the opponent's clock, yeah? But in this match, we saw a much more solid Nepo. And, well, this is actually a game where Nepo did kind of prove to be a little bit more true to himself. Because, well, we had this this b5 line that he played that, well, quickly led to a very messy position where Carlsen played sort of in a very Dubov-esque style to sacrifice the pawn rather than trying to get the pawn back at any price. Well, admittedly, if I covered every single move of this match, of every game of the match, well, this video would be 10 hours long and would, you would fall asleep and wake up and the video would still be running. So I'm going to take you straight to the key moment instead, where Carlsen actually kind of misplayed this a bit. I didn't mean to show this position, but it gives you an idea of how sharp and unbalanced this game was. And it was really a big turning point in the match. So at some point, Carlsen misplayed the position, and basically he ended up going for an exchange sack that probably was not completely sound, but somehow Nepomniachtchi did not manage to really punish it. And his position was kind of a critical one, really, for the whole match in general. It's so funny, actually, after this game, there was this funny sort of post-game analysis. You know, it's very rare, actually, for the players to kind of analyze at the board after the game in the World Championship match. Normally, it's, okay, we played this game, let's just get the press conference over and done with, make some witty quips to journalists' dumb questions, and then go back into, you know, the man cave and do some more preparation or some more resting for the next game, as it were. But this is sort of a position where actually you might want to try to improve on Nepomniachtchi's play, because it's black to play, and if you find the right move here as black, there's a very good chance that you win the game. So if you want to put your move in the comments, it's move 23 for black in case you want to show your chess expertise and use the actual chess notation. But yeah, what's the move that you're going to play? So pause video if you need more time, and I will refresh myself as you do that. It's one of the secrets of being a grandmaster is knowing how to sip your water to stay hydrated during a match. In any case, well, maybe I can start by showing you some of the options that I think are not the very best ones. You know, rule out a few of the candidates. Actually, when I showed this position to one of my inner circle members just recently, he suggested this move of Queen C7, saying, well, I don't want my rook opposite the queen, the white rook opposite the queen, because then maybe there are some annoying discovered attacks on the queen, yeah? But Queen C7 runs into Queen to G4, and, you know, this line is actually quite useful for seeing what white is aiming for in this position, and showing kind of the nature of white's compensation, not just, you know, with the very strong monster outpost knight on D6, but also if black were to defend the pawn with bishop C8, how, you know, you can play bishop E4 and kind of sacrifice quite a bit of material, but in the other hand, you've got like rook D4, and I mean, if black were to be a little bit careless, and let's say he takes a pawn saying you can't hurt me, well, then there's bishop takes H7. Maybe I should have made that a puzzle for you guys, but I think you probably saw it already, yeah. King takes, Queen H5. And this is what white is aiming for, to play rook to H4, and to give checkmate with queen to H8. And the only way black avoids that, basically, is by sacking the queen, which is unfortunately not good enough in this position, yeah. So, that's what white is aiming for, and of course black could defend better. I mean, you don't have to, you know, choke on a poison pawn with rook takes B2, yes or yes. But still, this is what white is aiming for, and this is the sort of attack that Nepo admitted to being very concerned about in the game. And that's why he played the move bishop to A8, trying to clear this B file for the rook or by crook. But it turns out that there were better moves available. The move Queen E7 is probably a better version of the idea if you want to move the rook opposite the queen, because if we compare these two queen moves, of course, the E6 pawn is defended against queen to G4. But if queen G4 is white's best move anyway to kind of build up the attack, then definitely, yeah, this is the better choice. And also, quite relevant point, like let's say we imagine, for example, that white has the queen on H5 and rook on H4 with this similar idea. Well, the queen E4 makes a big difference when you can actually sack the queen for the rook and avoid getting mated. So that's an extra defensive option you have with queen E7 that you don't have after queen C7. So does that all sound good? Well, it turns out there's actually an even better move for black. You know, Lasker's old saying, when you see a good move, look for a better one. So some of you might be wondering, well, the attack is coming anyway. We can't exactly get rid of this D6 knight, normally speaking, because the light squared bishop isn't going to turn to a dark squared bishop unless you're cheating. But B takes A4 is kind of a better version of the bishop A8 idea, because you're not only opening up the B file for the rook like you would with bishop A8 in the game, but also you're grabbing a pawn, and sometimes the more material you grab, the more you can give back to neutralize the opponent's attack, true or true. So if white goes bishop E4 now, then black can play this very solid move of G6, just not allowing that bishop H7 and that attacking idea I showed you before. And now after queen takes C4, this is another point where, as I'm giving you more puzzles from black's point of view, but most of you are watching this video, you're probably, the way you play chess, just thinking, what can I do to my opponent? What can I do to my opponent? And you're always solving puzzles from the perspective of the side to play. So actually, by looking at it from the opponent's side, it actually is good at teaching you how to not just play good ideas for yourself, but to see the good ideas for your opponent so you don't make those blunders. Make sense? Well, let's see if you found the move with black to play. And you are welcome to pause the video if you need a little more time to think about it. So the answer is that c5 is the key move. Okay, if you play some other move, you're not exactly losing, but if you give white the time to play, let's say queen takes a4 and pile the pressure on these pawns, then white will get full compensation for the exchange with a very strong knight on d6. In fact, in a very similar way to what happened in the actual game, yeah? Because white kind of has enough positional compensation for the exchange here based on black's weak pawns, the bad bishop, and the fact that black rooks maybe don't coordinate that well, yeah? But if black has an exchange and a pawn, then it's a little bit of a different story. Now, typically, and this is a principle that maybe is not so well known at most levels of play, like, probably the principle of putting the rook opposite the queen to sub-discovered attacks is well known, but what's less well known about it is the corollary that if that rook is undefended, then sometimes actually is good to have the queen opposite the rook, because now black can play the move c5 and achieve his big dream in this kind of position, which is to liberate his bad bishop, and it's well worth even giving up a pawn to do so, because that's the only real problem of black's position, yeah? And this position is all about mobility, maximizing the mobility of your pieces, so that you have that activity and you can take control back of the game. And of course we can see that white can't just play knight takes b7, because then the rook is on pre, yeah? Pretty nasty for white. But otherwise black just manages to trade the bishops. I mean, something like bishop takes b7, rook b7 is the same problem for white. You can't take the rook or you're just losing everything after queen takes d1. And otherwise, you know, black is just up in exchange and a pawn and has made sure he claimed the initiative, as you can see with the threat to the pawn on b2, as it were. And black will just play around the d6 knight. So a bit of a long explanation, but this was really one of the very key moments of the match. Because, I mean, I mentioned before that if you're able to win with the white pieces and win the first game, it's a big advantage. In fact, one of the press people at the event, Grandmaster Heinz Niemann, one of the most promising young US talents as such, right around 2630-ish at the time of this video. Well, he said he thought that whoever won the first game of this match would basically just win the whole match altogether. And at first, a few people on social media criticized him for this opinion, but it actually turned out to be an incredibly precise one in terms of predicting the direction of how the match would go, as it were. And certainly if you win with black, that's an even bigger advantage because, well, then you have an extra white game as well to continue pressing. Because like I said before, it's much harder to win with white than it is to win with black. Very good. And so, in this position, black played bishop a8. Computer says that you should play knight takes b5 and, you know, kind of cut your losses and grab the pawn, even if it gives black the counterplay down the b file. But Carlsen plays bishop e4 instead. And, yeah, once again, if Nepomniachtchi had played the move g6 here, which he didn't do in the game. He kind of played this weird c3 that somehow was a little bit sort of trying too hard to play safe rather than really pushing for the win. But he played if black had played the move g6 at this point, then black would be clearly better here, where it just does a good job of dealing with any bishop h5, h7, queen h5, attacking ideas like this. And if white does play for some h4, h5 to open up the king, well, the queen can always defend on the king side, and somehow white is not quite able to get enough firepower to actually mate the black king, at least according to the computer. Always easier when you have the computer on compared to if you're playing it in the actual game, yes or yes. So in the end, Nepo kind of missed these chances. I'd say b takes a4 and move 23 was the bigger opportunity, but in the end, the position was very complicated, and this is probably what led Nepo to say, after the game was finished, oh, this is the worst World Chess Championship game ever played in terms of lowest quality. And Carlsen was like, sorry? It's like just so taken aback by, you know, Nepo actually saying something after the game. Just didn't expect it. But anyway, that was probably the biggest opportunity that Nepo had in the first 5 games of the match, and I will skip ahead a little bit past the next few games. Though in the pattern that you kind of see in these games is that Carlsen was just sort of playing this very solid martial time after time, saying, well, my preparation is very strong and you will never break with the black pieces. Interesting bit of trivia, by the way, that actually the last time that Carlsen had lost a classical game in a closed Spanish was actually in 2015, which I think was in Norway chess against Vishy Anand, if I remember correctly, though I could be misremembering that. If there's another game that is the right one, you can always share it in the comments. But yeah, basically, Nepo played a4, and again, Carlsen didn't play the main move of b4 and, went into the main line of Nepo's preparation, but instead, he kept playing these shortcuts. So, in this game, in game 3, he played bishop b7, the recommendation of his second, Jan Gustafsson, who is, of course, a big expert on the marshal for black, including these anti-marshal lines, of course. And, well, Carlsen just held a very solid draw. This third game was kind of a almost flawless game. You could say, actually, the most accurate game ever played in a World Championship match, but it was not super interesting. So, we'll move forward to game 4, where Carlsen says, okay, my approach is going to be different. With black, I'm going to stick to my guns, play the same solid thing every time. And with white, I'm going to vary and try to find ways to set problems. So, given that the Catalan didn't work very well in that game too, where Nepo came very close to winning, as we saw, Carlsen says, well, what have you got planned against e4, you Russian team? And it turns out the answer was that the Russian player, Nepo, decided to play the Russian game. So certainly being very nationalistic with his opening choice. But okay, on a more serious note, Petrov is a very solid system. In 2018 as well, Caruana used it to basically neutralize Carlsen's white pieces, or at the very least to neutralize Carlsen's e4. And this is another very well played game. Neither side made any kind of mistake, and the game did end in a rather quick draw as such. Where at some point Carlsen realized, if I don't make the draw, I'm just going to be worse, so he just accepted it. So then we move to game 5, and here Carlsen showed his ability to kind of avoid the preparation of Ian Nepomniachtchi's team, where instead of playing the move b4 or the move bishop b7 of game 3, he said, well, I can vary as well, and he played this move of rook to b8, which is quite a rare move. I mean, it used to be assumed that in such positions that it's not a good idea to play rook b8 because you're giving up the a file to the white rook, and white can then try to get some sort of initiative. But at the same time, it also leads to a lot of exchanges, and what eventually arose is a position where Carlsen was a little bit worse and had to suffer a little bit, but eventually got this very symmetrical kind of structure. Of course, he's not the only moves, but this is what happened in the game, where black just basically liquidated the queen side. Got this very symmetrical structure here where, black is a tiny bit worse on at least on a practical sort of level, but at the same time, it's very solid. Carlsen was able to, maneuver the knight to g6, just not have any weaknesses. And when Nepo didn't find the best opportunity to kind of try to grind it out and to put some pressure, then the game just ended in a draw. Because one thing to keep in mind is that Nepo is not the most technical player. Of course, he has this aptitude. He's a top 10 player in the world, even top 5 player in the world. So, of course, he is very skilled at every phase of the game, but the sort of more technical, slower, strategic positions don't come as naturally to him as they do to Carlsen. But in these sort of very messy, complicated battles like we saw in the second game in that Catalan, well, that's a bit of a different story, where Nepo can almost fight on even terms with Carlsen if Nepo is in really good form. So in any case, let's continue to the game 6, and this was the one that effectively determined the direction of the match. And here I have a little bit of a hot take, actually, because what most people were saying from the outside looking in, I was reading the many reports and, of course, following the match and the different commentaries by different GMs quite closely. There are a lot of really good commentary teams on the match, actually. There was, Giri and Polgar on Chess24, which was maybe the one I watched most of all, along with the Chess.com one with GMs Caruana and Robert Hess, and also Danny Wrench, International Master. That was also quite entertaining and interesting commentary. And then you had some other ones like Kramnik and Svidler commentating on their own, I think on Ilya Levitov's channel, if I remember correctly. And you also had the FIDE official commentary with Vishy Anand and Anna Musichuk. And then there are different Twitch streams like Hikaru Nakamura and many others also streaming the commentary of the match live. So definitely a lot of places to enjoy very high quality analysis in real time, but of course not everybody has time to spare, let's say 4 to 5 hours each day to watch a commentary, so that's why it's great to have these shorter videos summarizing it for those of you who want to kind of understand the sort of how the match kind of went on, sort of also like a psychological level and on a practical level as well as, okay, this move is a mistake because the engine said so. In any case, game 6 was very interesting, also very indicative of Carlsen's approach, that he decides not to, play c4 and go down this rabbit hole of e6, but says, alright, let's just play a different move order. And so he plays this move G3, and at the time I was just shocked. I was like, what, why G3? Doesn't, Nepo know that you just play C5 and just get this kind of improved Grunfeld with this sort of idea? Okay, it's obviously not as simple as that, and definitely Carlsen had prepared some ideas of his own to make this kind of interesting. I've analysed these positions quite a lot myself because I would get them a lot in Blitz, but that's another story. Nepo says, oh, well, I'm just going to play E6 because after Bishop G2, if I just play my normal preparation, well, you don't have better than C4 anyway to transpose to Catalan. And Carlsen says, well, when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. So he played the move B3, saying, well, let's just prepare C4 and not give you this DC4 and B5 weapon that you spent the burn the midnight oil preparing, as it were. And this did succeed in getting Nepo to start thinking quite early. After C5, we had takes, and C4. I mean, admittedly, the early part of this game was not so interesting. The position just became very, very symmetrical, and, basically out of the opening, I'll just fast forward a little bit. And really, Knight B2 is a very interesting idea, kind of Dubov style, where you sack the pawn, but you try to get some nice initiative with the piece play. But Nepo just avoided it with Knight C6 and went for this very direct equalizing approach where, by the time we get to a position like this, and I hope you don't mind me not explaining the moves, but I do want to get to the more critical moment of the game. But, at this point, I mean, the position is basically just equal. Yeah, the structure is symmetrical. Black has succeeded in challenging the strong Catalan bishop on the long diagonal. And generally when Black does that and completes his development, he doesn't really have any reason to complain, as it were. And so the game ended up being equal for a long time, but Nepo, maybe sensing that Carlsen was a little vulnerable, said, well, I'm going to try to push for the win in this game. And I think basically one of the main reasons that Carlsen won this match, or conversely why Nepo lost, is I think that for the long term, Nepo didn't really stay true to his natural style, which is to kind of complicate, to play quickly and confidently, to set lots of practical problems. And I think that when it comes to a World Championship match with this much tension and pressure, it's only for so long I think you can play a way that is not sort of natural to your own style. I mean, if you look at the earlier matches, say, the Karyakin played against in 2016 against Carlsen, Karyakin came very, very close to winning this match, actually. Against Carlsen, he actually had the lead after beating him in Game 8 with the black pieces. And basically, Karyakin just stayed true to his very solid style, saying, well, okay, it's natural for me to make solid draws against the top players, so I'm just going to keep doing that. And I'm going to let Carlsen kind of come to me and try to, beat me as such. And that was an approach that worked quite well, even though Karyakin did eventually lose that 2016 match in the tie breaks. But even to get to the tie breaks, given the rank difference between players, was already quite a significant achievement, in my opinion. And then it was similar with the 2018 match against Caruana, yeah? When Caruana stayed true to his style, he prepared positions that came quite naturally to him, that he already had some experience in, yeah? And where he could really try to out-calculate and out-prepare Carlsen, because that was where his strengths lay more relative to Carlsen at the time. But Nepo, he sort of, tried to play this very solidly and safely, but that's not the way that Nepo normally plays. And around this game, this is where he started, I think, psychologically break, say, okay, I have to play my natural style, I can't play this solid, boring chess anymore, sort of thing. I don't think he was thinking sort of, consciously, but kind of subconsciously. I think this is what was simmering beneath the surface somehow. And so later on, well, basically this decision here was another interesting point where, well, maybe I can ask you guys a question if we take the move that was played in a game of rook a to c8. Well, after this, white traded the queen for the two rooks with queen takes, and, well, at this point, who do you think is better? Do you think it's better to have the two rooks and a knight, or the queen and the bishop in this kind of position? So this is one that actually divided a few different commentators, in fact. Jan Timman, in a recent interview I watched, actually expressed the opinion that it's much better for white practically to have the two rooks and the knight. And I guess the reasons for that are because, well, the pawn structure is kind of symmetrical, yeah? And a symmetrical pawn structure tends to work quite well for, the side with the knight and be able to keep things stable for the rooks. And also it's true that when it comes to these Catalan positions, that if we were to trade off the rooks and the queen just in our minds, imagining just the knight against the bishop, well, the white knight is a lot more effective than the black bishop in these kind of Catalan structures. Of course, added point, a black structure is less flexible because of the doubled F pawns. However, it's not quite that simple because at the moment the white rooks are not so well coordinated. They're not defending each other. And also, Black's pieces are quite active, and with moves like Queen of D5, Black was able to show that he had his trump cards as well. Then with B4 and A4, he was able to show the A3 pawn as a weakness, so it's not the easiest to defend in a very comfortable way, yeah? And okay, I will fast forward ahead a little bit, because actually this was really the game that I think was the most exciting and also most interesting, perhaps from a sporting perspective. In fact, I was even considering at some point to do a whole YouTube video just on this one game, but I came up with a better idea, as you can see here. It's all like Lasker saying, if you see a good video idea, look for a better one. Of course, I didn't have really video back then, but, you know, I'm paraphrasing. Anyway, the game continued E3, and, well, it was kind of interesting to see Nepo really push for the win and try to exploit Carlsen's time trouble, because on the one hand, it didn't really work, but on the other hand, it could have worked extremely well. So what do I mean by this? Well, we had H5, you know, both players just trying to play solid moves, get close to that time control move 40. You see, a very important thing to understand with this World Championship match is that the time control was one where basically, well, you didn't have this like increment that you normally have for the tournament where you gain time on the clock after each move as such. But instead, they had a set amount of time to play their first 40 moves. So no incrementing. If your clock went to 0, you know, before getting the extra time at move 40, then you lose the game. And then that's the way it worked. And then you had another time control where it had so many moves. I think it was like, if I remember correctly, it was 2 hours to play the first 40 moves, and then another 1 hour to play the next 20 moves up to move 60, and then another, I believe, 15 minutes from there, but getting an extra 30-second increment from move 61. Is that a too complicated time control? Well, this is one reason why these guys were playing the World Championship, because they're actually able to follow the time control they had. And if you're able to, then well done. You did better than most of the field. Anyway, continuing on, after King H2, the players are getting a bit low on time, and so the position started to become very sharp. And Nepo said, okay, I'm not just going to play Queen B3, kill the pawn, get a passed pawn, and make a boring draw, according to the engine. If it wasn't obvious to you, it's not so obvious to me either, but because I'm cheating, I can say that the point is after knight takes C5. And not the only move, by the way, but just to give you an example. If we had something like this, say Rook D7, Black starts gobbling all the pawns, but you've got the blind pigs on the 7th, devouring everything like it's a trough. And I mean, this is just going to be it'll end up being a draw, or I can give some checks as such, but, you know, the king is sort of able to get away, like Rook G7 would actually be a mistake, because the king runs away, and then the A-pawn is a big problem. But if I play some more solid move, like, let's say, King to G2 or something, well, it turns out that Black's not really in time to actually queen the pawn, because you can go, like, E4 in this position, if I follow correctly, and you don't really have a way out of the perpetual check with, you know, checking on G7 and H7 and so on and so forth. So that would have been, let's say, the correct quote-unquote outcome for the game. But instead, Black played a move Bishop B2, and this is where the game really spices up, where Nepo smells the blood and he says, okay, I'm going to push for the win, and I'm going to try to beat Carlsen. And you know what? It almost worked at this point. So what would be your idea if you were playing white in this position? There's actually a very strong move for white, but it's very, very hard to see. In fact, Carlsen actually messed it up in the game, so it's your chance to improve on the World Champions play, as it were. Well, okay, to be fair, Carlsen did actually find the right first move at this point. You know, if you need more time, you could always have paused the video, but I think you noticed by now, yes or yes. So Carlsen throws in the intermediate move, Rook take to C5, because, well, I mean, if you play Rook to B2, the problem is that your Rooks are so passive defending this pawn that you're not really going to play for a win. You know, say Queen B3, and, you know, these Rooks are kind of stuck together like glue, you know, kind of like the, you know, two brothers that can't stand aside of each other, but they can't separate because they're family. So it would just be a, you know, a fortress of sorts, or we could say a mutual inability to make progress. But Carlsen realized that you can throw in an intermediate move, a very powerful tactical device, and actually if I remember correctly, I actually talked about this in one of my earlier videos, are you making these most common chess mistakes? I might put it up as a card there at some point, so you can enjoy it for yourself. But yeah, Rook to C5, this is the key intermezzo. Using the fact that you need to keep that pin on the D file to not put the bishop on pre. This is why, you know, playing bishop B2 is a little bit too cute, as it were. Black plays a move Queen to D6, and yeah, this is the point where Carlsen missed an extremely difficult winning idea, as evidenced by the fact that Nepo also overlooked it. it's one of these cases where it's like, if you don't find the winner's white, you're almost worse. So really very critical moment. And I guess if you know that there is a winning move, that makes it a bit easier for you to find it if you would like to pause the video and think about the continuation. So in the game, what Carlsen did is he played a move Rook D1, which has the idea of trying to prepare Bishop Knight takes B2, but of course it's a mistake. Well, maybe of course it's being a bit harsh, but certainly like the move Bishop A3, we're going to see later on why this was a bit of a problem from White's point of view. So what's the answer? You're not going to believe this one, guys. The idea is that we play the seemingly suicidal Rook C to C2. And after Bishop A3, the idea is not to play Rook A2 and blunder all of our pawns with Bishop B4, but it's to blunder in an ingenious way with Knight to F4. And before you think that, you know, the coffee is starting to make me like completely crazy, well, the point is that after Queen takes B4, you go Rook to D7. You set up the blind pigs on the 7th, and yeah, you've got the passed pawns, connected passed pawns even, but those passed pawns don't do you much good if you're getting mated, true or true. You don't have Queen F8 to defend because Knight takes E6 uses the pin very nicely, and if you play, let's say, Queen E4, trying to be a bit more aggressive, then White just goes Rook C to C7, and you can't defend this, unfortunately. You know, Rook takes F7 is already pretty close to being a checkmating attack, yeah? You know, something like, let's say, if I play Queen F5, for example, then we can play Rook takes F7, and, well, you can kind of see White's going Rook G7, and, you know, you've got Knight G6, and that's going to force a mate, or, you know, King E8, Rook E8, or if Black gives up the Queen, obviously, it's dead lost as well. So that's how the attack plays out with the Rooks and the Knight. I mean, it's well known that the Queen and the Knight are to work very well together in attacking the King, but two Rooks and a Knight, you don't see it as often, right? But if Black goes King to G8, trying to anticipate Rook takes F7, well, actually, it turns out Rook takes F7, if you're thinking that's the winning move. Maybe it's still winning, but it's not as clear after Bishop to D6. You know, you can sort of try to trade off the Knight, and then it's not so clear that two Rooks alone will mate the Black King. So a more clinical, or at least more effective way, is actually to play the move Rook to D8, or Rook C8 kind of comes to the same thing, where, you know, if they block with the Bishop, you go Rook C to C8, and, you know, they can't really save the Bishop anymore. It's kind of like very deep, but at points if Queen B4, you kind of can still like go for the attack anyway with, well, it's sort of very, very complex. Like, you don't have to find this move to win the game, but it turns out that, you know, Rook takes F8 actually is not a good idea, because then the plus A pawn and B pawn will be a bit too strong. But you can play these moves like E4 first, and somehow the Black Queen just eventually runs out of squares. Actually, it's very beautiful. It's very study-like, so if you don't mind, I will show you the full point. So after A3, White plays this incredible move, Knight D3. Realizing if Black takes the pawn, you can take, and you just give all the checks with the Rook and ends up being a mate. If that's too hard for you to visualize, I'll play it on the board with Rook F8, King to G7, Rook to G8, and basically at this point, Black really has nothing better than to give up the Queen, because with Queen H7, and in that case you may as well resign, because after King G8, we have Rook C to G8, and a very beautiful mating pattern where the, you know, smothered mate, the pieces get in the way of the King, or we can call the E6 pawn the traitor pawn, as it were. And if Black tries to keep that Bishop defended with Queen E7, this is the really beautiful domination of just taking away all of the squares from the Black Queen. The only winning move here is this, to give you a chance to solve it if you want to. The answer is Rook to E8. And with Rook E8, we more or less force move Queen D6 if they want to keep the Queen and Bishop alive for now. But then after this move, Rook C D8 completes the domination. We've already seen how if White can take that Bishop without Black being able to take back with the Queen, it's just a checkmate, like so. But otherwise, I mean, White is winning the Queen like this, and, well, it's just completely game over, yeah? So, very, very beautiful continuation. Actually, one funny point is that if they play A2, and let's say you have this, you know, this Queen, and then the Queen appears back to life like a phoenix, well, then you can just play Rook D to 8, and even though they got this square back for the Queen, you know, it's still completely lost. I mean, even if you just take the Bishop at some point, you know, you're a piece up in the ending, yeah? So, anyway, that's kind of the very, very beautiful continuation. I know I spent a lot of time on it, but I think you'll agree it was worth it to see this very study-like win for white. By study-like, I mean, like a composed chess problem where there's only one way to win. And that's why it's good for you to solve your endgame studies if you want to become the world chess champion one of these days. So, what happened in the actual game? Well, it was rook d1. And at first glance, this might seem like actually quite a smart idea as well, that with Carlsen's rook b5, you're trapping in the bishop, and granted, you're not exactly winning it, but how is the bishop getting out, The problem for black, and this is, by the way, a very common problem for the side with the rooks against the queen, is that the rooks are not very well coordinated, and what the side with the queen is trying to do typically is to continually sort of attack these rooks so they don't have any time to consolidate, just keep on attacking the weak pieces or weak pawns. And so, well done if you came up with the move rook d7, or queen d7 I should say, which exploits the fact that the rook doesn't really have a good square. Let's say, for example, if you play some solid looking move like rook b6, for example, trying to keep your pawn defended. Well, this is a good moment to pause the video if you want to try to find the tactical problem with this move. Though, to be fair, there's sort of several issues, but the main one is that you have this move queen c7, yeah? And the point is that if you're able to get to fork like rook a6, queen c2, then black is just winning the house here, true or true. So instead of that, Carlsen realizes that, well, since trying to save the b pawn loses a lot more material, as it were, he played a move rook c5. But this is where the game kind of got to the point, and this is where I started to feel that Nepo kind of just psychologically broke down, like, okay, I can't handle the pressure of playing the World Championship match anymore. And there's actually a lot of interesting points to the position. I mean, because the videos are quite long, I won't go through every single one of them, but I will point out the rather obvious question you probably have of, well, why didn't black take the pawn when bishop takes b4? It's a very good question, and yeah, I'm not really sure, but I have to say that this, I think, is not the reason why Nepo lost this game. He played a move e5, which actually ended up being a very good practical decision, because in order to see that e4 is the only move for white, you have to see some very complicated points. And again, while it's maybe not exactly the question of how Carlsen won the World Championship, it's so beautiful that I just have to share it with you. The point of e4 is that, well, it might seem that queen to d4 is just forking everything at once, yeah? But the point is that white can now sacrifice material in a very beautiful way to create a fortress. The key is to start with the move rook to a5. Technically, the move king g1 is not losing either, but it's a lot more difficult, whereas rook a5 kind of forces a position that white will be able to hold, more or less. So it might seem at first that, okay, if these pawns get traded, like let's say queen e4, rook d2, and take on a4, the idea of rook d2 being to, not allow a queen e2 fork, well, in a position like this would basically be holdable for white. It might seem that black can try to set up some tactics, but somehow white is always just in time. It can keep attacking the bishop and, well, not give black that time to sort of take the knight for free, because we keep attacking him, yeah? But the move queen c4 is a bit trickier, and with queen c4, the idea is that after rook takes a4, the black will go queen to b3, and again with this fork, win the exchange. But it turns out that white actually has a very beautiful fortress at this point. Well, after queen takes a3, white now plays the key move of b5 in this position, which at first glance might seem like a mistake, but the thing is, if you sit on the position, black's going to put that queen on c2, and you're not going to be able to keep this fortress of the knight and rook defending each other. So that's why it's quite important to play b5. And then after queen b3 forking these pawns, it's also quite important then to play the move rook to d2, making sure this stays defended. And the first point is that if black plays queen takes b5, white just goes king g2, and it turns out that, or f3 is also working, by the way, but basically you end up setting up this kind of position, and with all the pawns being on the one side of the board, the queen is not really able to be that much more effective than the knight and the rook. And if white, let's say, plays something like knight f2, king g2, there's just no way through for black, and it's just a quite straightforward fortress in the end. Of course, you have to be a little bit careful of the move order. You don't want to play knight f2 immediately, because there might be some queen f1, and that would sort of break the fortress a bit. But say if you go king g2 and then knight f2, there's no way through against the white pawn structure, which of course has no weaknesses at this point. So that's the first point, but you might be wondering, well, what if black were to play to move queen to c3 at this point? How would white deal with the fork against the knight and the rook in this case, with white to play? That was your cue to pause the video if you didn't figure it out. And if you did figure it out, well, congratulations. It turns out that there is only one move to save the game for white, and it's a very beautiful idea. Very much study-like once again. And that is to play the move b6 at this point. So what's the idea of b6? Well, after black takes the rook, if you don't take the rook, you actually end up losing to this sort of thing. But after b7, we see that this knight just covers everything. It covers b4 and b2, the two squares to get behind the passed pawn. It covers queen takes f2. And also interferes with the queen going back this way to stop the pawn queening. Absolutely beautiful, wouldn't you agree? So after queen d3, you know, black is technically a pawn up here, but the fact is that with all the pawns on one side of the board, you know, if you're not able to actually promote a pawn into a queen, then you're not going to win the queen endgame for the most part. White's just going to sit on the position, defend the pawn, and it's just going to be a very clear draw from this point. And if black does try to push his double F pawns trying to promote a pawn or get a passed pawn, well, that's going to open up the door for perpetual checks by the white queen. Yes or yes. So instead of that, well, Carlsen played the move rook c2, you know, thinking, okay, I want to be able to meet e4 with knight b2 and defend the rook. And for me, this was the very surprising part of the game where, I mean, you're probably wondering the same question. Yeah, why doesn't black just grab the free pawn and play bishop takes b4? And, well, I don't really have a great answer to this question, because if black takes the pawn and uses that pin on the d-file, black is just up a pawn for nothing, and I think there's advantages almost enough actually just to win the game full stop. So, on that basis, yeah, this was the simple way to play. The plays were short of time, and Nepo, for some reason, wanted to try to make things still complex and just go kind of crazy and trying to trick Carlsen in time pressure. But this is not really the optimal approach. Might be like, if you see a good move when you're short on time, just play it, you know. Take the pawn and think later, you know. But instead, Nepo played queen d5, and then after the move rook d to d2, the opportunity was kind of gone for Nepomniachtchi, as it were. You know, queen b3 was met with rook to a2, and, you know, black, he can't take that pawn, actually, with bishop b4, because then white actually, well, okay, Kant is a bit strong, but white can play, you know, rook db2, if you want to be fancy, and, you know, white will get this position with the two rooks against the queen that, okay, technically speaking, it's drawable for black, but it's pretty obvious that only white can win. The two rooks are a lot better than the queen when the rooks get stability as a general principle. So, in any case, it's a game, I'm not going to show, like, every single move, but I want to sort of make the point that eventually the players got to this endgame. This is going very far ahead, but Carlsen kind of got this ending that was a little bit better for him. And so this is Carlsen sort of specially to squeeze the blood out of the stone, like I mentioned early in the video when saying how Carlsen won the World Championship in the first place in 2013 against Anand. And so they eventually got to this position. Let me just fast forward a little bit. So I think, yeah, this is a good demonstration where, you know, the table base, you know, saying is a position a winner, a draw, or a loss. Well, it turns out the position is technically a draw if black plays it correctly. But I think you'll agree that this position only white can win. White has all the winning chances because, again, the queen is particularly good when the board is kind of very open, when there's a lot of different action happening on both sides of the board, a lot of tactics. That's when the queen really shines and shows its power. But in this sort of hand-to-hand combat where you have the play all happening on one side of the board, well, then the rook and the knight being two pieces are actually very competitive with the queen being one piece as such, because you kind of in a sense have one more attacker, potentially against, say, the h5 pawn, and they have a defender. And for a long time, Nepo did manage to still hold it, keep it within reach of a draw. I'm not going to comment deeply on these moves, but just to give you a feel for the way in which Carlsen actually won this game, because it's obviously very pertinent to the video, as it were. Well, we had rook a1, so I just continuing to kind of maneuver around, slowly improve the position and, you know, making sure there isn't some queen h1, queen h2 perpetual check ideas. This is why Carlsen put his rook on a1 specifically to cover both the penetration points as such. I mean, if they play queen c4, they still don't have a check. And even if they did have, let's say, some check later, like king f3 keeps the king safe. Yes or yes. So the game went queen b7, rook a2, and to this point, I mean, these moves are not exactly good or bad. They just keep the position sort of at the same evaluation of black can draw, but white is the one playing for the win. And so knight f3 is just a nice move, just making sure there are no checks against the king, at least for the moment. Queen b1, rook d6 makes sure that the checks again can be blocked, so keeping up that sort of, that pressure. And so you don't want to play like e4, e5 too quickly, because then that might just open up your own king more than anything else. So Carlsen, knowing that he has all the time in the world, continues to just maneuver and gradually wear down black's resistance. Queen a2, rook d2, queen b1, rook e2, you know, opening up some ideas maybe to push that e-pawn now that the rook is behind the passed pawn. Queen b6 is played, trying to cover that with the pin. Rook c2, queen b1, knight d4, queen h1, and okay, rook c7. The players just continue to, you know, ring around the rosy, as it were. So at this point, it might not seem like a whole lot is happening. You know, this is the game that was the longest World Chess Championship game in history at 136 moves. So this is why I'm not spending loads of time like talking about every single little decision, but you can sort of get a feel for how Carlsen just kind of, you know, almost making black dizzy with the, you know, the constant maneuvering. So for now, not a lot is happening. Black is keeping the fortress, but then at some point, Carlsen decides to make the push. Realizing it, you know, you have to try something to try to win the game, yeah? So rook d6, king g7. So eventually he gets his pieces kind of all on the right positions. He figures out, okay, this is the very best way for me to position my pieces, making sure that everything kind of defends one another. Obviously, it doesn't matter the king is unprotected because, well, the king is in check. You know, you have to deal with the check anyway. Yes or yes? So now white makes the push e4, saying, okay, I'm going to push my pawn and build a very beautiful pawn chain. To which Nepo actually defends quite well still. Queen h1, rook d7. Of course, the players were staying at a little bit lower time at this point, and Nepo says, okay, I don't just want to sit on this position forever. You know, you could try to play some solid move or something like this, but Nepo says, well, trading the pawns in principle makes it easier for me to draw when I'm worse. So let's play h4 and open up that white king a bit to have more chance of a perpetual check. Sound good? Well, we had g takes h4, queen h3, king d2 takes, and still the position is technically a draw. But I would say that white's winning chances may have improved a little bit in the sense that, well, black doesn't have a pawn anymore, and we've got two connected passed pawns still, so it's still quite nice for us. And the knight does a very good job of covering the checks on the king side, yeah? And if the queen goes at queen side, well, then the knight will do a good job of covering the checks from the queen side instead. I got mixed up my queen side, king side, but I think you got the idea. The knight is a very good blocker. So we had rook d3, king f8. Still like the game continues in a very steady fashion. You know, white just continuing to maneuver. Because keep in mind, like, if white pushes a pawn, it resets the 50 move rule, and the game goes on a lot longer. Queen a5 was played. It doesn't spoil the draw, but it's maybe a slight imprecision, because now the queen is not so well placed. And the rook is again well supported to potentially push the pawns. I mean, you want to be a bit careful sometimes of when you push the pawn exactly, because if you push it too early, maybe you give black some opportunity to try to blockade the pawns, although I think this is not such a big problem. And there would be definitely an argument for playing e5 and, you know, trying to get the connected passed pawns a bit further, even though it does potentially open you up more to perpetual checks, but I don't see it as being a big problem at this exact moment. But okay, Carlsen said, I don't need to rush, and he played more slowly with knight g3, which is at the very least not a weaker move than e5. We had queen d2, king f3, queen d1. I'm going to fast forward ahead to the point where Nepo actually collapsed, because while his maneuvering does have some instructional value, I think that's not the main, let's say the main reason, the main reason was basically that Nepo collapsed later on in the game. Though, of course, this maneuvering and wearing down the resistance is a part of the mistakes that, of course, blunders at the top level don't happen in isolation, but usually it happens due to some other things that happen in previous moves of the game, like figuring out a lot of tough decisions beforehand, or in the case of this match, something that happened earlier in a previous game, like this one. So king e7, white goes rook e5, and we're starting to see, well, the white's position is starting to come together in terms of the harmony, that now white has managed to play e5 at a time where, once again, everything is protecting each other, and if you give white enough time, maybe you can start to even, you know, advance the position steadily, say knight e4, and kind of put the same position, but where the pawn just moves steadily forward with the support of the pieces. Of course, actually doing this without allowing a perpetual check is not so easy, and if black did play it correctly, he would still be able to hold, but you can see now that white is making a little bit of progress, at least on a kind of practical level, and unfortunately for Nepo, to move queen e6, this is essentially was a big turning point of the match. Of course, some of the earlier points where Nepo missed chance to win the game were also potential big turning points that were not exploited, as it were. You can sort of see that this is the point where, on the previous moves, Nepo had a lot of moves that would still keep the draw, objectively speaking. But this is a point where Nepo had to be very precise in order to hold. There's actually only 2 moves that hold the draw for black. And you know that Queen e6 is not one of them, but can you do better? What would you play here as black? Unfortunately, you can write in the comments without losing your voice. This is a bit of a long video by me, but I know you're enjoying it because you're still watching. So let's continue and see what black should have done instead. So the 2 drawing moves actually have kind of the same idea. It's either to play queen to b1 or to play the move queen to c2. And the idea of this is basically to not allow white to basically consolidate the position. Because if white is able to, let's say, push this pawn and get the rook kind of supporting and erring defending each other, if the pawn gets a 6th rank, it actually becomes technically a win as far as I can tell. But if white plays e6 now, kind of the point is that black can play moves like queen c4 and just sort of not let white get the perfect coordination. You can't play rook e5 because then the pawn here is hanging, but if you go rook f6, then there's king e7, and we sort of see that white doesn't really get that harmony with f5, rook f7 in time. And something like knight h5, queen d3, well, now the king is not covered and black can give a perpetual check. Or at the very least force the king to such a bad square that white is never going to win, in a sense. So, with that being said, we can sort of see that it's very difficult for white to actually make progress, realistically. Let's say if you play queen rook to g5, well, black then has time to go, let's say, king d7, kind of stop the e-pawn moving, and again, if you play knight h5, try and get a similar setup as in the game, well, black can start to play moves like, let's say, queen b1 and start giving checks from the back now that this knight is not covering. And somehow white just is not in time to actually kind of both push the kingside pawns forward and avoid a perpetual check. So it ends up being a draw in this kind of slightly convoluted way. But in the game, Nepo thought that queen e6 was the answer, but unfortunately your queen is actually a lot worse placed blocking the pawn. And a big reason for that is because then when white plays rook f6, you're actually attacking the queen with tempo. So that allows you to get your ideal sub of rook to f6 and knight h5 with gain of time. Because once you get this kind of setup like we see in the game here, but so even if the black queen is on this sort of square, white now has this sort of protection where the knight shields the king, and then the king even is playing its role in supporting the queening of the white pawns. It's a very good example of a case where the rook and knight dominate the queen in that sense, very problem-like once more. And so the game concluded queen h7, granted maybe not the most tenacious defense, but black was already losing anyway. Now, very nice move of e6. I mean, of course, rook f6 should also be winning as it helps support f5, e6, but e6 shows very good tactical awareness even at this very late stage game by Carlsen, realizing that queen takes f5, knight g7 is a little fork after all. So the game saw queen to g6, and now another very nice tactical blow by Carlsen. Actually, there's only 2 winning moves for white here, so you might want to try and figure out what it is, because it's a very instructive move, and when you see this move, you'll say, yes, this is the reason why I love playing chess and why I love watching chess videos on YouTube. It's to see these ideas like rook to f7. And black can't take the pawn because knight g7, and I think it's not taking a genius to realize that the pawning after king to g5 is winning, because once your king gets in front of the pawn, and once you outflank him like this, it just becomes very easy. Once you get the king on the 6th rank, it's always going to be a win, yeah? So, in any case, the game went a little bit differently. Instead, black played king d8, but after f5, queen g1, and knight to g7, finally Nepomniachtchi resigned game 6, because you can give some checks, but the king is eventually going to kind of weasel its way out with some, move the king around to g8, guard against the checks, and then black has no good way to deal with e7 check and e8, making a queen. Because when you get the queen, the ending, you get mating material, yes or yes. So this was a very long game, and I know that we spent a lot of time just on this one, but this really was the big game of how Carlsen won the World Championship. If I had to show just one game to show how he won the match, then this is the one that really set up the whole subsequent battle. You see, in the next game, in Game 7, well, Nepo just played very solidly, but again didn't manage to break Carlsen's rook b8 move and never really had any realistic advantage in this game. And so we had the game 8 after this one, and this one Carlsen had the white pieces. And actually this game is one I already covered in my video, Are You Making These Most Common Chess Mistakes? I'll put the card up there so you can see, but if you, let's say, want a very brief version, basically Nepo played his Petrov, but he played in a way that didn't really meet the demands of the position. So instead of trying to play some very solid like bishop e6 and try to make a solid draw and then try to turn around the -1 score with the white pieces, he decided to just play like very aggressively and try to force an attacking position at any price. But in doing so, he kind of just weakened his position. You know, moves like h5, queen e1. You know, like king f8, for example, is not a very objective decision. You should just play queen e7, trade the queens, make a solid draw, and move on to the next game. But instead, he tried to make things more unbalanced and kind of just end up in this very passive position where he just had this bad bishop on d7 against a good bishop on d3. Like I said, I already covered this game in the previous video, so I'm not going to repeat the same things I said here as well. But essentially, Nepo kind of beat himself. This was where it became obvious that Nepo just psychologically not ready for what might happen if he loses a game. Because keep in mind, this is a 14-game match, not like a 12-game match that Carlsen played in his previous World Championship matches. Previous 4 World Championship matches even. You know, when you have, let's say, if Nepo had drawn this game, well, he'd only be down 1 point with 6 games to play. And 6 games is a lot of time to actually get a win on the scoreboard once again. Because, you know, it's also not necessarily so easy for the opponent to say, oh, I'm so close to winning a World Championship. It can also, they can sometimes get in their own head if they are not careful. Much like what happened with Carlsen at 2013 Candidates, where he was running away with the tournament. Then he lost, you know, these 2 games in round 12 and round 14 when the finish line was in sight. But anyway, moving on though from this game, I do also want to talk about the final few games of the match, where you can see that Nepo just never was really able to kind of recover and made some very uncharacteristic blunders. I will say though, I do have to give Nepo some credit for at least playing c4 and, you know, realizing that banging your head against this marshal is probably not going to, you know, give you the wins that you need. You've got to try something different. And Nepo had actually been playing the English with quite good results in the last couple of years. It's sort of interesting, like, before the match you have these kind of mind games where, of course, the players are still playing many tournaments before the match, as it were. But then you saw they're not necessarily playing their real weapons, but then there also might be some games say, well, I am playing my real weapons, because you might think if I just play everything except my real weapons, then you know what I'm going to do. So I'm going to throw in a few games where I play my actual weapons as well, so that you don't know what's coming exactly. So these sort of mind games even before the match. So the English was kind of a smart choice, and, you know, Carlsen played it very solidly, end up getting a position like this where, you know, where basically white is a tiny bit better, but black is, well, basically fairly solid. And, okay, after this a3, this actually was a point where, you know, Nepo probably could have still fought for some advantage. You know, Carlsen kind of played this system that, you know, this is sort of Carlsen's approach. He didn't really try to play absolute main lines like this is the most reliable equalizer the way that Nepo did with black. Instead, Carlsen's approach was, well, let's find a more unusual way to equalize where we take the opponent out of their preparation and get more of a game where we can try to outplay them. And that really started to bear fruit in games 9 and 11, as we'll see, because Carlsen actually managed to win this game. At this point, though, if white finds the right move, which is not b takes a3 as played in the game, but rather this move b4 actually gives white quite a strong queenside initiative. I mean, allowing stuff like b5 and the knights to get kicked around would be quite dastardly, but after knight takes b1, white's idea is to play knight b4. The idea is to play rook b1. You can't actually take that pawn because then the knight gets trapped here. But if black plays the move knight c6, then knight takes b7 kind of shows up that black has got some very big weaknesses, and the Catalan pressure of the bishop on long diagonal is quite serious, yeah? But if black goes b6 instead, which is the advice of our chess engine, well then white plays rook takes b4, and still white has got a very nice advantage after rook to b5. I mean, it's not enough to win the game by any means by itself, but you can see, for example, at cd4, knight d4, you know, he's hitting the knight, is also hitting the rook with discovered attack. So that means that white basically is able to get his pawn back, and, you know, black is a little bit awkwardly placed with the weak pawn, and his pawn being isolated. Again, not enough to win. Black can probably hold with bishop b7, but it's not exactly the most pleasant task that black could have. Let's put it like this. But later on in the game, well, ba3 kind of missed the opportunity a little bit. You know, white is, after all, weakening his structure a little bit with this isolated a pawn and the d pawn potentially coming under some fire as well. And so eventually this position arose in the game after rook a4, and actually when I was showing this to to the members of the inner circle just recently, or of my inner circle, well, basically, what I noticed is that the position is one where even though computers has just equal, somehow white's most natural moves don't really work all that well. Because if black is able, let's say, to... Well, even though white is up a pawn in this position, basically, these pawns are all quite weak, and white's not really in a position to kind of defend all of them at once. Like, yeah, let's say if you play rook ac1, well then, a2 is hanging, and all these pawns become very weak, yeah? If you play rook ec1, defend the pawn this way, then this pawn falls, and suddenly these pawns are now very weak. So you can sort of see the problem that white can't really defend all of his extra pawns at once. To defend the pawns, you know, all of these at the same time, as it were. And actually, probably white's best move is just to play the move f3. Well done if you found this idea. Saying, okay, I'm just going to give back the pawn on c4, but, you know, if you take, I can try to get my rook active, and granted, it's a position that if black doesn't take the pawn and throws in knight f5 to hit this guy and only then takes the pawn, then it ends up being quite close to equal and probably just a draw. But, I mean, okay, it's still like, you're down 2 games, but you have 5 more and you could still try something at least. Unfortunately, what happened for Nepo is he made a very big blackout. I think you could only really describe this as a slip in concentration by white to not see why the move he played as a blunder. So white played move c5, and I realized that this game was only played so many days ago on the 7th of December. But what would be your move here as black in order to win the game? Anish Giri found it instantly. Are you able to find it as well? And Carlsen also found it instantly, by the way, because I remember I was watching the live commentary of, you know, the sort of the players, like, looking, you know, their faces and expression on the board. And Carlsen has, like, this, his eye just, like, sort of lit up, like, what? Really? No way you can do this, just c6. And the bishop is trapped. So, well then, if you saw c6, it's kind of funny in a way, because if that pawn is on c4, c6 would be a very big positional mistake, because white would go knight c5, and then the bishop would actually be perfectly placed to support the a-pawn queening. But here, knight c5 is not available. You can't take your own pieces, unfortunately. And so black just ends up winning the bishop after f3, knight h6. White doesn't really have anything here. I mean, after rook e4, black now plays the move rook to a7, and the bishop is simply trapped at this point. After rook b4, rook b8, black is just winning the bishop because of the pin, and, well, even without the pin, the bishop doesn't have a square. Yes, so yes. And, well, black grabbed the free piece and went on to win very, very easily from this stage, where Nepo resigned on move 39. Maybe I can show you the final moves just to give you a quick synopsis. White trying to create some swindling chances with the passed a-pawn, but Carlsen neutralized it very comfortably here, showing that you even can afford to play the move knight takes g3 and just grab some more material while they try to queen the pawn. And that's because after knight a4, black has a very important move to secure the win. That being the move c5, so that the bishop is able to stop the pawn in its tracks. Because, I mean, if white plays something like knight b6, which is not what happened in a game, but just to explain it, you just go bishop to c6. And I mean, white can queen the pawn, but at the end of the day, he's still down 2 pawns. And in fact, is probably losing a third one with knight f5. Just they all drop off like flies. So white went knight c5, and after rook a8, black has a piece up for absolutely nothing, and so Nepomniachtchi resigned at this point. So yeah, that was pretty much what decided the match. I mean, basically, Nepo just had this blackout, kind of trying so hard to win that he just naturally rejected the moves that would make it a solid draw, kind of almost subconsciously, and he was only left with the blunder that was basically lost. And so game turned out being a very safe draw, Carlsen realizing it, okay, I can pretty much coast to the finish because there are only, 5 games left to have a 3-point lead. So if I draw 3 more games, then I, win the title. And so against the Petrov, he didn't even play like his main ideas, but just play like this knight d3 shortcut. And so Carlsen was white in this game, just got this very symmetrical kind of structure where, I mean, it's going to be very hard for black to realistically play for a win. It's funny because it's actually a line I recommended in my inner chess improvement repertoire that I have for my chess improvement system members. But anyway, it was a very safe draw for white. And then we are left with game 11, which really was kind of the last chance for Nepo to kind of play for a win in the sense of like, because Carlsen at this point only needed 1 point, or you could say 2 draws or 1 win, from the next 4 games in order to retain his World Championship title. Just like if Nepo doesn't win this game, he may as well like give up the match in a sense. So for all intents and purposes. And actually, I remember when I was watching a commentary, it was kind of interesting that both Danny Wrench and Robert Hess... Actually, I remember, I think it was Robert Hess and Fabiano Caruana who were predicting a Nepo win, and Danny was predicting a Carlsen win, if I remember it correctly. And it was sort of funny in a way that actually, like, at the time I was sort of saying, you guys are completely crazy, it's so obvious it's just going to be a safe draw, and then there'll be one more game. But it turns out, well, that actually Carlsen did manage to win this game and basically have an incredible 4-point margin to win the title. And actually, on the chess chat poll on the Australian Chess Forum, it's kind of funny that nobody actually predicted that Nepo would win by... That Carlsen, rather, would beat Nepo by 4 games. 7.5, 3.5 score is the... As I mentioned earlier in the video, the 4th most decisive score by percentage in a World Championship match. And I don't remember when the last one was that was more decisive than that, but it was like around like 1950s or so, somewhere around this time. So, very long time since a player, won so decisively in such a match. And here, Nepo, well, I'll show the full game, actually, but I'm not going to spend much time talking about the opening, because we kind of, we're already a long way down this this rabbit hole. So, we had this, and Nepo said, okay, the Royal Lepet's not really getting me anywhere, so I'm going to try to play this sort of maneuvering game, modern Italian, and try to outplay Carlsen here. But once again, Carlsen came prepared with his slightly unusual but very interesting ideas. Normally Black castles first or plays h6 and then goes a5. But the early a5 is something that's been played a lot by very strong engines. But normally they do it in connection with some move like castles or maybe h6, and sort of move bishop a7 by Carlsen is a little bit of a small surprise, but not necessarily an inferior move. Nepo in turn plays knight a3, trying to get the knight in this way, but Carlsen goes h6, and h6 is actually a very kind of interesting idea in some of these positions, that if they play h3, you're sort of saying, well, am I going to go g5 and try to sort of hack your king? Though I think it was a bit of a feint by Carlsen, and probably he was just going to castle and just play it very solidly. Well, after this, Nepo plays knight c2, and yeah, to me it's a slightly surprising decision that White didn't try some move like knight b5 and try to use this square, but game saw knight c2, castles, and we just had a lot of exchanges, bishop e3. Carlsen played bishop takes e3, which, granted, is not the first choice of the engine. The engine wants this very weird-looking bishop b8 for some reason. But I think it's a very human move, just trade off the pieces and just get a very solid sort of balanced position, because it's not like Carlsen needs to go crazy for the win here. You could play bishop e6 directly, because the double pawns actually kind of give you counterplay down the f-file in that case, if White were to take. But rook e8 was played instead, preparing bishop e6, and well, intending to take back with the rook to keep the structure as stable as possible. That is what happened in the game. White did actually take on e6. Though I think in a must-win game, something like bishop b5 and trying to keep the piece on the board might have been a better option, but instead we had bishop takes, rook takes, and I'm going to fast forward a little bit just to show you the really critical moment of the game. Because at this stage, a bit of a maneuvering battle. It's not admittedly the most interesting phase, but of course the players had a good understanding of what was happening, yeah, with queen d7, knight h2, rook at d8, and, in the end, this position. After knight g4, take. Well, this is kind of an important moment, actually, where you sort of need to find this move, I think, as Black, if you want to be 100% sure of achieving equality. So, the answer here in this position is, well, this is kind of an idea that is very consistent with the idea of playing knight e7 and rerouting the position of the knight. So, well done if you found the move of d5, which is a very standard move in the, what's the opening? In the modern Italian. Good that you're still paying attention, because we get that space in the center, and, if White does trade everything on d5, we can see that such a structure like this would even be somewhat more pleasant for Black, because you've got the space advantage, and the d3 pawn is a slight weakness. Though, of course, realistically, it should still be a draw, yeah? But White plays a move d4 instead, trying to create some tension in the center, and that was in itself quite an interesting decision. Well, what would be the way to deal with the tension? The answer is that way Carlsen played it with e takes d4. And since rook e4 is kind of nothing, White tried to move with e d5, trying to make it a bit more tricky. But Carlsen defended this very well, and by the way, this one If you don't find exactly the right move as black, you're kind of losing. So if you want to, you can pause the video to try to play like Magnus Carlsen. So Carlsen realized that if you play knight takes d5 here, that rook takes d4 just wins the knight, basically. You know, because of the pin, and c6, c4 is easy enough. Yes or yes. So instead of that, black plays a move rook e4. Very important move to make sure that you're able to meet rook d4, and then, you know, be able to take that pawn back and keep the balance. So instead of, you know, playing this and just having a boring draw, Nepo says, well, I've got to win somehow. So he plays queen c2 and, you know, hits the rook with an intermezzo, since this is, after all, a stronger threat than d3, yeah? But after rook f4, this is where Nepo kind of had to just admit that he doesn't have anything in this position. The best way to play would be just to take the pawn. I think I may have forgotten to remove some of the color commentary, so you're going to get to enjoy that along the way. But yeah, rook d4. This is the correct way to play the position, like knight takes d5, and it ends up being it's a completely equal position. You know, queen d4, b3, just complete symmetry more or less, and of course you can't take the pawn because of queen takes d8, so it's just a draw. But instead of doing this and I guess losing the match gracefully, well, okay, it's true, Nepo could still in theory have won the final 3 games match after this and force a tie break, but odds of this are like 1 in a million. But instead we had the move g3, and unfortunately for Nepo, it's not just that g3 is a blunder, but it almost forces Carlsen to kind of find the winning continuation. Because, I mean, if you move the rook, you're just down material for nothing, yeah? But the move d takes e3 is a decisive exchange sacrifice. In fact, it's so strong it's hard to even speak of it as a sacrifice, yeah? Because, I mean, the queen is coming in the attack, and this is just very, very strong. You know, king h2, you can even take the pawn with a check, and, you know, just white has nothing, really. It's going to be very similar to the game, actually, in this case, just without this pawn. So Nepo plays king f1, trying to escape. But then queen h3 follows, just continuing to not give white a breather. If white plays a move king to e2, we can simply take this pawn, because king f2, queen h2 would simply win the queen, yeah? And otherwise, you know, the knight is coming in, the rook is coming in the attack, and the king finds itself, you know, stuck like Malcolm in the middle. The game saw king to g1, and okay, this is the point where there's actually a lot of winning continuations for black. In the game, Carlsen went for this continuation with knight f5 that ultimately led to a rook ending that was a pawn up and a very straightforward win that Carlsen did convert quite easily. But I will point out that there was actually a faster win for black, and if you want to, you can pause and try to find an even better move than knight to f5 at this point. So maybe some of you realize that a very nice attacking idea is to play the move rook to d6 with the idea of rook g6 and mating the king. The problem with this, though, is that after rook e3 and rook takes g6, that white can now turn the tables on you with queen takes g6 hitting, leaving this queen still under attack, and then it's white who is winning. So hopefully you didn't fall for that, but then you might also, if you did, you may have then realized subsequently that we can refine this idea quite significantly, either the move knight f5, which you already know is what Carlsen did, and what allowed Carlsen ultimately to win the game with basically preparing rook d6, g6. But the even simpler way is to go e takes f2. Since king takes f2, queen h2, we kind of saw in another variation, yes or yes. But if queen takes f2, well, now the idea works. Just rook to d6, and white rather has no defense against rook to g6, just winning, or even forcing checkmate, or, you know, queen g2, rook g6, just still, you know, winning the queen at the very least, with a massive material advantage and a winning attack. So yeah, that was how the match went. Of course, it's true that I skipped some moves at certain points, because otherwise the video would be a lot longer, but in summary, this is the way that Carlsen won the World Championship this match. He managed to neutralize Nepo's white pieces while still doing it in a way where he avoided his opponent's preparation and got positions where in games 9 and 11 he was able to outplay his opponent and kind of punish rather big mistakes by Nepo. And we saw really what the key moment of this match was, essentially game 6, where in game 6, well, Carlsen was sort of able to handle this very tense mutual time scramble better. And then when Nepo kind of missed a winning opportunity with, you know, just taking the free pawn, well, Nepo kind of collapsed because of not playing in the sort of the true nature of his natural style. And Carlsen exploited that by grinding out the win in his typical style in game 6, the longest ever game in a World Championship match to this point, and then just continue that momentum where Nepo just kept on trying to attack in positions where it wasn't warranted, or just missing very simple moves on the basis of, well, if I play this move, it just ends in a draw. So he'd play a worse move to avoid a draw and end up succeeding by losing instead. So that is how Carlsen won the 2021 World Championship match against Ian Nepomniachtchi with a final score of 7.5 to 3.5. That's about all from me. Do make sure to comment below what was your favourite part or your favourite move that Carlsen played in this video. Do let us know in the comments below. And I will see you guys in the next video. Have a good one.